James Carter never imagined he would become a killer. But when he found his disabled son Ethan lifeless in his bed, the bruises on his fragile body told a horrifying truth. Rebecca, the woman he had trusted as a wife and stepmother, had been torturing his child in secret. As the weight of his failure crushed him, James made a decision. Justice wouldn't be left to the courts. The woman who stole his son's life was about to pay the ultimate price. James Carter had always been a devoted father. Life had never been easy for him, but the moment his son Ethan was born, he made a silent promise to protect him at all costs. Ethan had been diagnosed with cerebral palsy at birth, a condition that made him physically weak and required constant care. Despite the challenges, James embraced fatherhood with unwavering love. Every day was a struggle, but to James, Ethan was worth it. He worked long hours as a mechanic, ensuring his son had everything he needed: physical therapy, specialized equipment, and a comfortable home. For years, it was just the two of them against the world. Then Rebecca entered their lives. James met her at a community event, and she was everything he thought he wanted in a partner: charming, warm, and seemingly nurturing. She took an interest in Ethan right away, asking about his condition and offering to help whenever she could. James was relieved. He had spent so long doing everything on his own that the idea of having someone to share the responsibility with felt like a blessing. Within a year, they were married and Rebecca moved into their home. At first, things seemed perfect. Rebecca adapted quickly to the routines that came with caring for a disabled child. She accompanied James to Ethan's doctor appointments, learned how to prepare his meals, and even insisted on taking care of him while James was at work. James felt lucky to have found someone so understanding. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't alone. But things began to change. Subtle at first, barely noticeable. Ethan, once a happy and talkative child despite his limitations, became quiet. He withdrew, no longer as excited when James came home from work. His laughter, which once filled the house, became rare. James chalked it up to the natural struggles of growing up with a disability. He convinced himself that Ethan was just having a hard time, that it was normal. Then the bruises appeared. Small at first, easy to dismiss. A mark on his arm, a scrape on his knee, things that could be explained by accidents. Rebecca always had an excuse. He had fallen, she said. He had trouble keeping his balance, she reminded James, and it made sense. Ethan's condition made him fragile. James wanted to believe her. The excuses, however, began piling up. One day, Ethan had a swollen lip. Another day, a bruise across his ribs. Rebecca continued to brush it off, and James, already exhausted from work, let it go. But the nagging feeling wouldn't leave him. He started noticing how Ethan flinched when Rebecca entered the room, how he barely spoke in her presence. Neighbors mentioned hearing crying coming from the house, but Rebecca dismissed it as Ethan being frustrated with his condition. James wanted to believe he had made the right choice marrying Rebecca. He wanted to believe that his son was safe, but deep down, something felt terribly wrong. And soon he would realize the truth was far worse than he ever imagined. Ethan's world had become a place of silent suffering. Every day was a battle, not just against his physical limitations, but against the cruelty that awaited him behind closed doors. Rebecca, the woman who had once seemed so kind, had transformed into a nightmare. When James was home, she played the role of a caring stepmother, tending to Ethan's needs and offering her support. But the moment James left for work, everything changed. It started with neglect. Rebecca would ignore Ethan's basic needs, leaving him in soiled clothes for hours or refusing to feed him until he cried. At first, he tried to tell his father, but every time he did, Rebecca would punish him when they were alone. She learned to silence him, using fear as her greatest weapon. The bruises became more frequent, the excuses more elaborate. She made sure the injuries were in places that could be hidden: his torso, his upper arms, his thighs. She was careful, calculated, and cruel. As time passed, her abuse escalated. She began locking him in his room for hours without food or water, telling him he was a burden. She would take away his mobility aids, leaving him helpless on the floor, forcing him to crawl if he wanted to move. His cries for help were met with indifference. On some nights, she would yank him out of bed and force him to sit on the cold bathroom floor for hours as punishment for something as small as spilling water or making noise. Ethan's body grew weaker. He was losing weight at an alarming rate, and his pale skin took on a sickly tone. His father noticed, but every time he questioned it, Rebecca had an answer ready. She claimed Ethan was refusing to eat, that he was going through a phase, that his condition made him prone to weakness. James, exhausted from work and desperate to believe that his wife was doing her best, ignored the warning signs. The neighbors had their suspicions. They had heard Ethan crying late at night, his sobs muffled through the walls. Some had seen Rebecca dragging him by the arm or speaking to him with a venomous tone when she thought no one was watching. But no one interfered. No one wanted to get involved in family matters. The silence of those around him sealed Ethan's fate. Rebecca's hatred toward Ethan only deepened. She began taking her frustrations out on him in new ways, pushing his fragile body beyond its limits. When he was too slow to move, she would shove him. When he didn't respond fast enough, she would slap him. The more she hurt him, the more pleasure she seemed to take in his suffering. Ethan, once a bright and hopeful child, had become a shell of himself. His spirit was breaking, his strength fading. He had no one to save him. The people who should have protected him were blind to his suffering. And soon his small body would no longer be able to endure the horrors inflicted upon him. James had always been able to shake off the stress of work when he walked through the front door, knowing that Ethan would be there, waiting with his small, tired smile. But lately, that smile had disappeared. The house felt different, colder, heavier, as if something unseen was lurking in the shadows. James couldn't pinpoint what was wrong, but the unease in his chest grew stronger each day. He told himself he was overthinking, that Rebecca had everything under control. After all, she was home with Ethan all day. She would never let anything happen to him. But then, Ethan stopped meeting him at the door. Some days, he barely even looked up when James walked in. He stayed curled up on the couch or in bed, his body frail, his face blank. When James tried to talk to him, Ethan would only mumble short answers, his eyes darting toward Rebecca before quickly looking away. One evening, James came home earlier than usual. He hadn't told Rebecca he was leaving work early, and as he stepped into the house, something felt off. The air was thick, the silence unsettling. He set his keys down and called Ethan's name. No answer. He moved through the house, checking each room. When he reached Ethan's bedroom, he hesitated. The door was slightly open, and inside, he saw Rebecca standing over Ethan, her hands clenched into fists. The moment she noticed him, she straightened up, her expression shifting into something unreadable. Ethan, curled up in the corner of the bed, was shaking. James demanded to know what was going on, but Rebecca, as always, had an excuse. She claimed Ethan had been acting out, that he was refusing to listen, that disciplining him was necessary. James felt the rage rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Arguing wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he walked over to Ethan and gently touched his shoulder. The boy flinched. That was when James saw it. Fresh bruises along his arms, his collarbone, his ribs. This wasn't a single accident. This was something worse. That night, James barely slept. He lay awake, replaying every moment, every odd excuse, every time Ethan had tried to tell him something without words. How long had this been happening? How much had he missed? His gut told him the truth. Rebecca had been hurting his son. The next morning, he made a decision. He would take Ethan to the doctor, get him checked out, and find out exactly what was going on. But when he told Rebecca his plan, her reaction was immediate, defensive, furious. She claimed he was overreacting, that Ethan was fine, that taking him to the hospital would only make things worse. Her insistence sent a chill down James's spine, but it was already too late. That evening, when James came home, the house was silent again. This time, when he went to Ethan's room, the boy wasn't breathing. His small body lay motionless, his skin cold to the touch. James' worst nightmare had come true, and Rebecca stood behind him, unbothered, as if nothing had happened at all. James felt like the world had stopped spinning. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at Ethan's lifeless body. His son, his only child, was gone. The small frame that had once been full of quiet strength now lay motionless, robbed of the life that had once shone so brightly despite the suffering he endured. James reached out with trembling hands, hoping, praying that maybe there was a mistake. But the coldness of Ethan's skin told him otherwise. His boy was dead. Shock turned to denial. This couldn't be happening. Ethan had been weak, yes, but he had been alive just that morning. He had still been breathing, still had hope in his tired eyes. James shook him gently, whispering his name as if his voice alone could pull Ethan back from the abyss. Nothing. The air in the room felt suffocating. Then behind him, he heard Rebecca's voice, flat and emotionless. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. Instead, she stood there, her arms crossed, as if she had been expecting this moment. James turned to face her, his heart pounding. Her expression was unreadable, cold. She muttered something about how it had been inevitable, how Ethan had always been too weak, how she had done what she could. The way she spoke sent a shiver down his spine. There was no sadness, no regret. It was as if Ethan had been nothing more than an inconvenience, something to endure until it was gone. James felt rage unlike anything he had ever known. His body trembled, his fists clenched, his mind clouded with fury. He wanted to scream, to grab her, to demand answers. But deep down, he already knew. Ethan hadn't just died, he had been killed. The bruises, the weight loss, the way Rebecca had reacted when he wanted to take Ethan to the doctor. She had been abusing him for months, and now she had taken it too far. James couldn't process what happened next. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He stormed past Rebecca, grabbing his phone with shaking hands, dialing for help. But she didn't seem worried. Instead, she scoffed, as if he was being dramatic. Her calmness made his blood boil. When the paramedics arrived, James felt like he was in a daze. He watched as they examined Ethan, as they confirmed what he already knew. His boy was gone. The police arrived shortly after, asking questions, taking notes. James told them everything. The bruises, the neglect, the way Ethan had been withdrawing. He told them about his suspicions, how he had ignored them for too long. Rebecca, however, stuck to her version of the story. She claimed Ethan had simply stopped breathing, that it wasn't her fault. She painted herself as the struggling stepmother who had done her best. And for a moment, James feared they would believe her. But when one officer pulled him aside and muttered that Ethan's injuries suggested otherwise, he knew justice was coming. But justice wouldn't be enough, because James had already made up his mind. Rebecca had taken the one thing he loved most in this world, and now he was going to make sure she paid the ultimate price. James sat in the police station, his mind numb, his hands still shaking. The weight of Ethan's death pressed down on him like a crushing force, making it hard to breathe. Officers moved around him, asking questions, taking notes, treating him like just another witness in a tragic case. But he wasn't just a witness. He was a father who had failed to protect his child. The guilt was unbearable. Every memory of Ethan, his laughter, his tiny hands reaching for him, his quiet resilience, flashed through James's mind like a tormenting slideshow. And then came the darker memories. The bruises. The nights he had heard Ethan crying but convinced himself it was nothing. The times he had believed Rebecca's lies. He should have seen it sooner. He should have saved him. Rebecca sat in another room, calm and composed, answering questions as if she had nothing to hide. She hadn't been arrested yet, just detained for questioning. James could see her through the glass of the interrogation room. She didn't look sad. She didn't look broken. She just looked annoyed. Like this was all an inconvenience, like Ethan's death was nothing more than a minor setback in her life. Something inside James snapped. He could already see how this would play out. There would be an investigation, a trial, months, maybe years of legal battles. Rebecca would claim innocence, manipulate the system, twist the narrative. Maybe she would get convicted. Maybe she wouldn't. Even if she did, what was a prison sentence compared to what she had done? What was a few years behind bars compared to the suffering she had inflicted on Ethan? James stood up, his mind made up. He walked past the officers, his body moving as if on autopilot. His grief, his guilt, his rage, they all fused into one singular purpose. He wasn't going to let the justice system decide Rebecca's fate. This wasn't about courtrooms and sentencing. This was about vengeance. His footsteps were steady, controlled. No one questioned him as he moved through the station. He had been cooperative, just another grieving father, not a threat. But they didn't know what was going through his mind. They didn't know that all reason had left him, that there was only one thing left for him to do. Rebecca was still in the interrogation room when James entered. The officers had stepped out briefly, discussing the case in the hallway. She looked up at him, her face unreadable. James didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, he pulled out the gun he had taken from an officer's holster in the hallway. The shot echoed through the station, freezing everyone in place. The glass of the interrogation room splattered with blood as Rebecca slumped forward, lifeless. By the time the officers reacted, it was already over. James dropped the gun, his expression unreadable. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He just stood there, staring at the woman who had destroyed his son's life, knowing that for the first time in a long time, he had done the right thing.